I have watched enough covert operations, indictments, and press conference victories to know when an event is being sold more aggressively than it is being explained. The reported arrest and indictment of Nicolás Maduro was framed as a decisive intelligence triumph, the culmination of months of clandestine effort and political will that previous administrations supposedly lacked. The language was familiar. Daring operation, gutsy leadership, a blow against narco-terrorism. Those phrases are not intelligence assessments. They are narrative instruments designed to project resolve and competence at a moment when both are increasingly questioned. What struck me immediately was not the operational claim itself, but the speed with which it was transformed into a regional warning. Almost before the details had settled, the conversation leapt from Caracas to Havana. Cuba was described as a failing nation, propped up by Venezuelan oil, ruled by exhausted men clinging to power. The implication was unmistakable. If Maduro could be taken, Cuba should be nervous. From an intelligence perspective, that leap tells you more about Washington's mindset than about conditions on the ground in either country. I spent years watching how intelligence successes are packaged to compensate for strategic drift. When policy lacks a coherent long-term framework, discrete events are inflated into proof that the system still works. The problem is that intelligence does not operate in isolation. An arrest, even if real and legally sound, does not equal regime transition. Indictments do not dismantle power networks, and public threats do not substitute for sustained leverage. Those are hard lessons learned repeatedly in Latin America, yet rarely remembered in Washington. The intelligence distortion begins when analysts are pressured to align facts with political momentum. Instead of asking what actually changes after such an operation, the system rushes to declare victory and identify the next target. Cuba becomes a talking point not because intelligence has uncovered a decisive vulnerability, but because the narrative demands continuity. Momentum must be maintained. Strength must be displayed. The audience is domestic as much as foreign. The strategic consequence of this approach is predictable. Adversaries learn to separate rhetoric from capability. Allies learn to discount public signals and wait for tangible policy follow-through. Inside the intelligence community, professionalism erodes as analysis is bent toward affirmation rather than evaluation. I have seen this movie before. The names and countries change, but the structure remains the same. The hard lesson is that intelligence loses its value the moment it becomes fiction in service of politics. When events are framed to prove a story rather than inform a decision, the system stops learning. And when the system stops learning, it begins repeating its failures with increasing confidence. I learned early in my career that the most dangerous moment for intelligence is not failure, but applause. When intelligence is publicly celebrated, it is usually because it has stopped being intelligence and started serving as political theater. What I saw in the aftermath of the Maduro operation was not a sober assessment of what had been achieved, but a carefully staged performance designed to reassure domestic audiences that American power still works as advertised. That instinct is understandable. It is also corrosive. Intelligence is meant to reduce uncertainty for decision makers, not to manufacture confidence for television cameras. Political theater begins with selective disclosure. Certain details are highlighted, others quietly omitted. Timelines become vague, operational complexity is simplified, and inconvenient facts are deferred to classified silence. I have watched this process play out repeatedly, from counterterrorism successes inflated into strategic turning points to covert actions framed as proof of regional dominance. The underlying distortion is always the same. Intelligence is no longer asked to answer the question, what is true, but instead, what can be said without undermining the narrative? Latin America has long been a preferred stage for this kind of performance because it sits at the intersection of historical familiarity and strategic neglect. Policymakers assume the audience understands the script: authoritarian regimes, popular unrest, American resolve, imminent collapse. That assumption allows intelligence to be compressed into slogans. When officials describe a government as a failing state or a leadership circle as on borrowed time, they are not offering analysis. They are signaling intent. The danger is that intent, once spoken publicly, becomes policy momentum regardless of what intelligence actually indicates. Inside the intelligence process, this creates a subtle but powerful pressure. Analysts know which conclusions will be amplified and which will be ignored. Over time, collection priorities shift toward information that supports anticipated outcomes. Ambiguity is treated as weakness. Dissenting assessments are labeled unhelpful or untimely. I have seen capable analysts learn to self censor not because they were ordered to, but because they understood how the system rewarded certainty over accuracy. The strategic consequence of intelligence theater is miscalculation. Adversaries who are portrayed as fragile often turn out to be resilient. Allies who are promised rapid transformation prepare instead for prolonged instability. Most damaging of all, decision makers begin to confuse narrative control with operational control. They mistake headlines for leverage and speeches for strategy. When reality eventually intrudes, it is framed as unexpected rather than inevitable. The hard lesson is that intelligence cannot coexist with theater for long. Once analysis is shaped to sustain a public story, it loses its corrective function. The system becomes trapped, repeating confident claims while its predictive accuracy quietly collapses. That is not a failure of collection or tradecraft, it is a failure of discipline. Venezuela has been misread by Washington for so long that the misreading itself has become institutionalized. I watched this happen in real time. What began as analytical optimism hardened into doctrine, and doctrine replaced evidence. Sanctions would fracture the elite. Popular unrest would force defections. International isolation would accelerate collapse. Each assumption was presented as intelligence-driven, yet none survived, sustained contact with reality. Instead of reassessing, the system doubled down, rebranding persistence as proof that success was just around the corner. The core intelligence failure was not a lack of information. We knew the regime's internal fractures were managed, not spontaneous. We knew the security services were structured to prioritize regime survival over national performance. We knew sanctions hurt the population faster than they weakened the leadership. Those facts were available, reported, and often quietly acknowledged. What changed was how they were weighted. Intelligence that contradicted the desired outcome was treated as tactical noise rather than strategic signal. Over time, Venezuela became a strategic mirage. Every protest was framed as the beginning of the end. Every election was described as the last fraud before collapse. Every external pressure was portrayed as cumulative and irreversible. None of this was supported by empirical indicators of regime disintegration. Power networks adapted. External partners filled economic gaps. The state narrowed its priorities to control rather than legitimacy. From an intelligence standpoint, this was not surprising. From a policy standpoint, it was unacceptable because it implied limits on American influence. The strategic consequence was paralysis masked as activity. Sanctions expanded without clear metrics for success. Diplomatic recognition shifted without altering facts on the ground. Covert signaling replaced overt strategy. When nothing changed, the explanation was never flawed assumptions. It was insufficient pressure, insufficient resolve, insufficient time. That logic is fatal to intelligence integrity because it turns analysis into a justification engine rather than an evaluative tool. The recent framing of Maduro's arrest as a decisive rupture fits neatly into this pattern. It offers a momentary illusion that the mirage was real after all. But intelligence professionals know better. Removing an individual does not dismantle a system that has been built to survive isolation and pressure. Power vacuums are not self-correcting, they are contested. Without a credible transition framework grounded in local realities, the outcome is instability, not alignment. The hard lesson Venezuela teaches is that intelligence failure does not always look like surprise. Sometimes it looks like confidence that refuses to adjust. When policymakers fall in love with a storyline, intelligence becomes the stagehand keeping the set upright. The mirage persists until the cost of maintaining it exceeds the value of admitting error. Cuba has occupied a peculiar place in American intelligence culture, less a country than a fixed idea. For more than 6 decades, Washington has predicted its imminent collapse with a confidence that defies the historical record. I have read the estimates, the cables, the interagency briefs that insisted demographic pressure, economic exhaustion, or leadership transition would finally bring the system down. Each cycle produced the same conclusion, and each time reality declined to cooperate. That persistence is not accidental. It reflects an analytical failure rooted in ideology rather than evidence. The myth begins with the assumption that economic hardship naturally translates into political surrender. Intelligence reporting has repeatedly shown that Cuban state control mechanisms prioritize resilience over growth. Scarcity is managed, dissent is contained, and external pressure is reframed as external hostility. From an intelligence perspective, this is not mysterious. It is textbook regime survival behavior. Yet, policy-driven analysis consistently treats hardship as a countdown clock rather than a stabilizing mechanism. When the clock fails to expire, analysts are told to reset it, not question the premise. The renewed rhetoric toward Havana following events in Venezuela follows the same script. Cuba is labeled a failing state dependent on Venezuelan oil, led by men portrayed as exhausted and illegitimate. None of that is entirely false. It is also incomplete. Intelligence assessments that focus narrowly on economic indicators, while discounting institutional continuity, miss the central variable: control. The Cuban system has never optimized for prosperity. It has optimized for endurance. That distinction matters, and it is routinely ignored when intelligence is bent to support coercive signaling. The strategic consequence of this misreading is predictable escalation without leverage. Public warnings substitute for private influence. Sanctions harden attitudes rather than fracture elites. Intelligence that suggests limited impact is sidelined because it undermines deterrence messaging. Over time, the system convinces itself that the absence of collapse is temporary, even as decades pass. This is not analysis. It is ritual. What concerns me most is how easily Cuba is reinserted into the narrative as the next domino. That language betrays a Cold War framework that intelligence professionals should have retired long ago. The geopolitical environment has changed. External patrons diversify. Information flows adapt. Regional dynamics no longer hinge on a single axis of influence. Treating Havana as a test case for American resolve may satisfy domestic audiences, but it tells intelligence officers nothing useful about outcomes. The hard lesson Cuba continues to teach is that regimes do not fall because outsiders announce that they should. They fall when internal power structures fracture beyond repair. Intelligence exists to measure those fractures, not to declare them into existence. When old myths are recycled as fresh warnings, it is not Havana that looks out of touch, it is Washington. One of the most damaging illusions I have seen take hold in Washington is the belief that controlling the narrative is equivalent to exercising power. Somewhere along the way, strategic communication began to substitute for strategy itself. Statements, warnings, and public signaling were treated as tools capable of shaping outcomes rather than reflections of intent. From an intelligence standpoint, this is a profound category error. Narratives influence perception, but they do not alter material balances unless they are backed by sustained capability and credible follow-through. In the cases of Venezuela and Cuba, narrative power has been used to mask the absence of real leverage. Public declarations of resolve are issued without corresponding adjustments in force posture, economic engagement, or diplomatic architecture. Intelligence reporting that highlights this mismatch is often acknowledged privately and ignored publicly. The result is a hollow deterrence model in which adversaries learn that rhetoric peaks quickly while consequences dissipate slowly, if at all. Real power is measurable. It shows up in logistics, alliance cohesion, economic integration, and the ability to impose costs over time. Narrative power, by contrast, is episodic. It flares in response to events and fades as attention shifts. When policymakers rely on the latter, Intelligence becomes a tool for timing announcements rather than evaluating capacity. Analysts are asked when a statement should be made, not whether it will matter. That inversion erodes the core function of intelligence as a constraint on wishful thinking. The strategic consequence is that adversaries adapt faster than the narrative cycle. They learn to absorb public pressure while reinforcing internal controls. They diversify external relationships to reduce vulnerability. They exploit the gap between words and deeds as evidence of American inconsistency. None of this requires sophisticated intelligence on their part. It requires only patience and pattern recognition. Meanwhile, allies observe the same gap and quietly hedge, reducing their reliance on American guarantees that appear increasingly performative. From inside the system, this dynamic produces a dangerous feedback loop. Each narrative failure generates pressure for a stronger narrative response. Language escalates because substance does not. Intelligence assessments that warn of diminishing returns are reframed as defeatism. The system becomes louder and less accurate at the same time. I have seen this progression before, and it always ends the same way: surprise, followed by denial, followed by retrospective clarity that arrives too late to matter. The hard lesson is that intelligence cannot rescue policy from its own theatrics. When narrative power is mistaken for real power, intelligence is forced into a supporting role it was never meant to play. The damage is not immediate, but it is cumulative. Over time, the gap between what is said and what is possible becomes visible to everyone except those most invested in maintaining the illusion. From an intelligence perspective, credibility is not an abstract concept. It is a measurable variable derived from pattern recognition. States watch what you say, but more importantly, they watch what happens after you say it. Over time, those observations harden into expectations. What concerns me about the repeated use of narrative-heavy operations and warnings is not how adversaries react in the moment, but how they recalibrate their long-term assumptions about American behavior. Allies notice when decisive language is followed by limited action. They notice when sanctions are announced without enforcement mechanisms, when red lines are declared without consequences, and when intelligence claims are celebrated without strategic follow-through. These observations quietly reshape alliance behavior. Cooperation becomes conditional, commitments are hedged, independent channels are cultivated. This is not defiance, it is risk management. Intelligence reporting has captured this shift repeatedly, yet it is rarely integrated into public policy discussions because it complicates the story Washington prefers to tell about itself. Adversaries draw a different lesson. They learn that American attention is episodic and that political cycles matter more than strategic patience. They test boundaries incrementally, confident that each test will be met with rhetoric calibrated for domestic consumption rather than sustained pressure. Over time, deterrence erodes, not because power disappears, but because its use becomes predictable and constrained by narrative needs. Intelligence assessments that highlight this erosion are often labeled alarmist until events force a reassessment that arrives years too late. The damage compounds in a multipolar environment. When American credibility weakens, alternatives emerge. States diversify partnerships, not necessarily out of ideological alignment, but out of practical necessity. Intelligence professionals understand this as structural adaptation, yet policy discourse often frames it as betrayal or malign influence. That framing obscures the real issue. Credibility is being spent faster than it is replenished. What troubles me most is how little institutional memory seems to matter. The same patterns that preceded earlier strategic failures are repeating, dressed in updated language but driven by the same assumptions. Intelligence warnings are acknowledged, filed, and then overridden by the need to project confidence. The system rewards reassurance over realism, even as evidence accumulates that reassurance no longer persuades the intended audience. The hard lesson here is unforgiving. Credibility is not restored by louder claims or sharper warnings. It is restored by alignment between analysis, decision, and action. When intelligence is sidelined in favor of narrative management, credibility decays quietly but relentlessly. By the time the decay becomes visible in policy outcomes, the cost of reversal is far higher than the cost of honest assessment would have been. The final lesson is not new. It is one intelligence professionals once understood instinctively before analysis was repurposed to defend policy rather than inform it. Intelligence exists to impose limits on ambition, not to decorate it. Its value lies in its ability to say no, to identify constraints, to warn when desire outruns capacity. When that function is abandoned, the system does not become bolder, it becomes blind. What I see now is an intelligence policy relationship inverted from its proper role. Instead of policymakers being constrained by analysis, analysis is constrained by the need to preserve momentum. Instead of uncertainty being explored, it is smoothed over. Instead of hard questions being asked internally, confident answers are delivered publicly. The result is a strategic culture that mistakes repetition for validation. If a claim is made often enough, it begins to feel true, even as the evidence erodes beneath it. The collapse of the American strategic narrative did not begin with a single war or a single operation. It began when intelligence stopped being treated as a discipline and started being treated as a resource to be managed. Once analysis is expected to support predetermined outcomes, it loses its corrective power. Failures are no longer signals to adapt, but obstacles to be explained away. The system becomes self-referential, citing its own prior assertions as evidence while discounting contradictory data as noise. This is how intelligence becomes fiction, not through fabrication, but through selection. Facts are not invented, they are curated. Context is not denied, it is deferred. Over time, the curated story becomes indistinguishable from belief. When reality intrudes, as it always does, the response is not recalibration but escalation. Stronger language, sharper warnings, new targets. The cycle continues, each iteration further from the original analytical ground. The hard lesson intelligence forgot is that power is finite, patience is required, and credibility is fragile. No amount of narrative control can substitute for strategic coherence. No public warning can compensate for private confusion. And no intelligence system can remain effective once it is judged by how well it reassures rather than how accurately it predicts. If there is a path back, it begins with humility, with the willingness to let analysis unsettle policy instead of affirm it, with the recognition that admitting limits is not weakness, but discipline. Intelligence does not fail when it delivers uncomfortable truths. It fails when those truths are no longer welcome. That is the collapse we are living through now, and it will not be reversed by another headline, another warning, or another carefully staged victory.